Ethics Untangled is made by the Idea Centre at the University of Leeds. It's a podcast about the difficult ethical questions we face in everyday life. In each episode, I interview someone, usually a philosopher, who's spent time thinking through one of these questions, and we try between us to work out what's going on. Today's question is one which you might not immediately recognise as important or, so to speak, pressing. The question is, what is touching through? It also might not be immediately apparent why this is an ethical question. As Robbie Morgan from the Idea Centre and Will Hornett from the University of Cambridge explain, however, it's a metaphysical question which has ethical implications. For instance, since assault is defined as unwanted touching, we need to know whether touching has taken place before we can decide whether an assault has taken place. And there may be cases where, if touching has taken place, it's taken place through something, and these cases might be tricky to adjudicate. Anyway, in this conversation, Robbie and Will introduce some possibilities for what touching through is before arguing for their preferred explanation. You can decide if you think they've put their finger on it, so to speak. Robbie and Will, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Jim. Great to be here.
And we're here to talk about a question which might seem a bit odd, I guess, to non-philosophers. It's the kind of thing that philosophers maybe sort of are used to discussing, but people who don't have a background in philosophy might kind of think this is a bit of a weird question. But the question we're here to talk about today is, what is touching through? So what do you mean by that? Why is that a puzzle? What's the question here?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. So I think the thing to start off with, just as a background consideration, is that it really matters to our moral and legal lives that we kind of touch each other. It's very central to the notion of assault, for example, that we can sort of hit and hit each other and so on. But one of the really interesting things is that it doesn't actually matter if someone's wearing clothes, right? If I push you and you're wearing a jacket and I kind of push you through your jacket, like, you still got a claim over me. You can say, hey, like, you shouldn't have done that. You shouldn't have touched me. And it would be kind of weird of me to say, oh, I didn't touch you. I touched your jacket. That's kind of facetious. That's the sort of thing children say. And so it's part of our ordinary way of thinking about our relations with each other that we can touch each other through things. But if you think about that for more than a second, you think that's actually kind of weird. Like, touching involves like two surfaces coming into contact, but my surfaces, my skin, haven't come into contact with the surfaces of your skin. Yeah. There is something in the way. And so how can you touch someone through something, and what's actually going on there? Yeah. And I think that's quite an important sort of question.
And what we also want to do is note that, of course, you can't touch someone through anything. Yeah. So if Will and I are on opposite sides of a wall, and I'm like touching the wall, well, I'm not touching Will through the wall in a way that if Will was next to me, I might kind of touch him through his jumper or something. Yeah. So we also kind of want a sense of, okay, so when can we say that someone has been touched through something, and when can't we? And we kind of want a principled reason for why some count and some don't.
So I can kind of see why that's puzzling and why it's an interesting question, but why is it an important question? Why is it something that we, should care about?
Yeah, so as Will kind of touched on, one reason we think it's important is this actually comes up in law. So we're kind of looking to see in the law of kind of assault and battery, does this come up? And one of the earlier instances we found was in the, I believe it was the deposition of Bill Clinton for perjury. They, of course, had to come up with a definition of sexual contact, because precisely what they were trying to establish is, had he engaged in sexual contact with someone?
Had he had sexual relationships with that? Sorry,
precisely.
Had he had sexual relations with that woman? Right?
Precisely. And but of course, this was kind of lawyers. So Bill Clinton's lawyer said, "Well, we need you to provide an exact definition of what sexual contact is, so that he can give a precise answer, yes or no, based on have those conditions been fulfilled." And one of the things they said was, well, clearly sexual contact has to include sexual contact through something. If one person touches another's buttocks through their trousers, we still want to kind of count that as a sexual contact. Yeah. There's a kind of touch, and it has to include touching through. And this kind of comes up in a few different legal contexts. So the reason we started talking about this was, for an earlier piece, I was working on something to do with the Sexual Offences Act. And that has a bit where it defines sexual assault in terms of touching, and touching includes touching through. I remember Will was sitting next to me. We were both doing a PhD at the time, and Will was sitting next to me and kind of glanced over and said, "Oh, touching through, that's a kind of interesting kind of idea."
Touching through what?
Yeah.
That was the question.
Yeah. So really this puzzle kind of came about because actually it's a legal concept, and in law you really want to have very precise definitions of stuff. It's really important that if we're working out whether someone has, say, committed a crime or done something, that whether they've met that definition or not. And this extends, of course, to like neutral and positive cases as well. As Will says, it's important for our like social and emotional lives, whether we've kind of touched someone. Touch is a really important part of what we do. So it kind of matters whether something counts as touching someone. And it seems like that's in some cases going to include touching someone through something.
Yes, good. Yeah. So it's kind of a concept that's part of our sort of, not just our legal language, but also our moral ethical language. And it's important to clarify these concepts if we possibly can. Yes. Good. Okay. So you go through a few different possibilities for what touching through might be. And well, the first one is the idea of contact, right? So I guess we've kind of slightly covered this already, but I suppose the naive thought might be, well, if I'm touching something and that thing is touching another person, then I'm touching the other person through that thing. Or, you know, for example, in the case where somebody's touching somebody else through their clothes, right? They're touching the clothes are in contact with the other person, therefore they're touching them through the clothes. And I guess there might be several layers of clothes, so it might be a kind of chain of things that all have to be in contact with each other. But you think that's not right?
Yeah, so we think that kind of like simple contact idea that's just, if I'm touching one thing and that thing is touching another thing and that thing is touching the other person, then I've touched the other person. We think that's not really going to be enough because, I mean, one reason is that there's no principled way of ever stopping it or saying how many layers are too many layers. So it seems like it would sort of explode and end up being the case that I'm actually touching everybody in the world because I'm touching my socks, which are touching my shoes, which are touching the carpet, which is touching the other things. And it's all going through the earth. It goes all the way through the earth's core to everybody in Australia. Yes. And that's not just silly. It is silly, but it would be morally problematic if that's what touching through was, because actually it would mean that I'm non-consensually touching everybody in the world, and they would have a sort of legal and moral right to say, hey, Will, stop doing that. Yes. And that just makes a mockery of the really important notion of assault. And so it's not just that it's kind of a bit wacky, but actually would have quite bad moral consequences if it was true.
Yes, okay, that makes sense.
There's something that we want to take from this contact idea, though. So there's a kind of reason we started thinking about this, which is, so suppose one person, touches another through their jumper. Well, the kind of obvious thing that's going on is the toucher is touching the jumper and the person being touched is also in contact with their jumper. And it seems like it's an important part of touching through that people have contact with the same thing. And then we might say, okay, maybe it doesn't have to be a single object. So suppose that Angela touches Billy on his shoulder and Billy is wearing both a t-shirt and a jumper. But we still want to say that Angela kind of touches him through these things, both the jumper and the t-shirt. And we say, okay, so part of how that works is that Billy is in contact with his t-shirt, which is in contact with his jumper, which Angela then is in contact with. And the reason we kind of make something of this is we think you probably can't touch people through air. There has to be a kind of an object or a chain of objects that someone makes contact with, and then another person has to be in contact with the end of it. So we think that contact has something to do with it. It's just not the whole picture.
Okay.
I think one way we'd like to put it is that there has to be a chain of contact, right, but that's not enough. Right. That's not enough that can't be the whole story. And so one way we can think about what the project is well, given like here's a really minimal thing that has to be there has to be a chain of contact. What else do we have to add to get a full theory of what it takes to touch someone through?
Great. Okay. And one of the things that you consider as a potential candidate for that thing that's missing from the account is causation, right? So the thought there would be Angela touches Billy through Billy's t-shirt and jumper because, the action of her hand is causing some change in Billy's body, right? So why is that not right?
Yeah, thank you. So I think actually, in order to answer this, it might be helpful for us to take a kind of step back. So I think in a lot of our responses to these ideas, it's going to sound like we're being very pedantic. And the reason for that is, like I say, one of the reasons that we think this is important is that it comes up in law where you need very specific definitions. And so if something meets that definition, then it counts. If something doesn't meet that definition, then it doesn't count. So what we're doing really in this project is something that philosophers often call looking for a necessary and sufficient condition for touching through. And what that means is we want a definition of touching through so that if something meets that definition, then it's touching through. And if something doesn't meet that definition, then it doesn't count as touching through. So part of what we're doing is looking at these potential definitions and saying, well, do they have any weird results? Is there anything that meets that definition but that shouldn't count as touching through, in which case maybe that's a problem for the definition? Or is there something that should count as touching through but doesn't meet the definition? And if that's the case, we think that's at least probably a problem for the definition. So where it looks like we're maybe being a bit fussy and pedantic, that's kind of why, because we want a really precise definition of this. So you're right. So one thing we thought was about causation. So Angela touches Bill through his jumper. If she touches his jumper, and that causes some change in his body, where the most obvious thing is going to be, she causes a bit of a depression in his skin. And I guess the reason that might be intuitive is that seems to be going on in most cases when we touch someone and kind of, well, how do we know that someone's touched us or touched us through something? Well, it makes a change to our body. It'll, even if that's just a kind of slight pressure on the surface of our body, it kind of makes a change there.
Yeah, and so it seems kind of plausible. It's a pretty intuitive sort of idea, but it does have some quite significant problems because it seems to rule in a bunch of cases as cases of touching through, which are pretty obviously not. Yeah. So, for example, say Angela and Billy are on a bouncy castle, but they're on different ends of it, and Billy jumps up, and as he comes down, Angela's going to fly into the air. Well, they're both touching something, which there's a chain of contact, the bouncy castle, and Billy causes a change in Angela's body by touching something. I mean, she flies through the air. There you go. So Billy has touched her through the bouncy castle. But, again, that's a little bit silly, right? That's nowhere near the kind of the sort of normal case that we're thinking of. It seems to rule in this silly case. Other kinds of examples would be if Jimmy and Joe are playing tug of war and they're pulling on this rope, the very long rope or something. They're causing changes in each other's body. Jimmy pulls and Joe kind of stumbles forward a bit. But it just seems like they're not touching each other through the rope, right? That's an utterly different kind of case. And so if you try to appeal to the causation relation, then you end up ruling in a bunch of these funny cases, which we should avoid.
And so I guess, the worry is that if someone accepts the causation definition, they have to say that these two groups of people are touching each other through something. They have to say that Angela is touching Billy through the bouncy castle because that's what the definition says. So that's a kind of worry about the causation account.
Good. Okay. So not causation then. The second possibility that you consider is something called counterfactual. So again, this is a bit of a philosophical, technical term, but basically all it means is, to go back to the Angela and Billy case, Angela touches Billy through his clothes because if Billy's clothes hadn't been there, then Angela would have touched Billy directly, right? So it's to say, something touches something else through that thing. If that thing hadn't been there, they would have touched them directly, right?
And we were thinking about, what's the kind of motivation behind this? Why might someone find this appealing? And the idea is kind of, in order to touch someone through something, we might think that you've got to be kind of touching something really very close to their body. Yeah. It's a kind of pretty central part of what it is to touch someone. Well, in direct touching, it's skin-to-skin contact. There is no space really between the two bodies. So kind of the reason we might think, well, it's touching through were it not for the fact that that Billy's jumper was there, Angela would in fact have touched him through the shirt. Well, part of what might motivate that is the thought that it's because, her hand is so close to him that were it not for the jumper being there, she would in fact be touching him. And it kind of captures that idea, I guess, that touching involves a certain kind of closeness. So there might be something to this counterfactual idea.
Yeah, and it sort of makes sense of part of what we were saying at the beginning to motivate the whole problem, that, we often note the distinction between directly touching and indirectly touching, but then set it aside for moral purposes. We sort of note that there's a difference, but it doesn't actually matter. And so one thing the counterfactual sort of idea is getting at is that, in effect, the clothes make no difference. Like, it would have happened. It would have been direct, except for the clothes. And so it might be one way of capturing this thought that there's something intuitive about the idea that we should set aside the indirection.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, that does sound quite plausible. So why is it wrong?
Yeah, so there's a couple of reasons. So one is that some of these are often just going to come out as false. So imagine that Billy is wearing a jumper that is, an inch thick. And if what we're saying is, well, if the story was exactly the same in terms of Angela's kind of hand movement, it was just that Billy wasn't wearing a jumper, well, then it's not the case that she would be touching him, because what she'd really be doing is hovering her hand about an inch away from his shoulder. Right. So we want to say that Angela touches or can touch Billy through the jumper, but it looks like the counterfactual account has to say that she doesn't, because if the jumper wasn't there, she wouldn't be touching him. She'd be very nearly touching him.
Yeah, and there's a similar sort of problem if you say, well, maybe the counterfactual we're considering is that you touch someone through something if you would have touched them directly were they not wearing it. Yeah. My friend is running for a train. He gets the train, and I kind of pat him on the back and say, "Well done." And maybe I touch him through his coat because I would have patted him on the back even if he were not wearing the coat. Maybe that's like one kind of view, but that kind of view is also going to get things wrong, because if my friend has been running for the train in hot weather, I might be willing to pat him on the back through the coat, but if he were not wearing anything on the top, then he's all sweaty. I'm not going to do that. And so you vary these factors, like whether someone's wearing clothes, and actually that varies what we're willing to do to them. Right. And so often, the counterfactual view is gonna rule out cases which pretty obviously should be ruled in. Yes. So it would say, I didn't actually touch my friend through my coat just because I wouldn't have touched him directly were he not wearing it. But I obviously did.
Yeah, and I guess also to kind of go back to the cases that are motivating this in the first place, like the kind of assault type cases, like in a case of when someone is accused of sexual assault when they've touched somebody through their clothes, it's not going to be a defense to say, I didn't touch them through their clothes because if they hadn't been wearing clothes, I wouldn't have touched them, right?
Yes.
That just makes a nonsense of the idea.
Yeah, and it requires us to kind of ask questions that don't have an obvious answer. Well,
yeah.
There might just be no fact of the matter about what someone would have done in a case where things were different. Yes. So there's cases where it seems like it gets the wrong answer, and there's cases where it just doesn't seem to give us an answer at all in a way that's kind of unsatisfying.
Yeah, good. Okay. All right. So that's counterfactual dealt with. And so the next suggestion that you consider is that it's something to do with feeling. So the idea being, well, who is it, Angela and Billy? Yeah.
We have there's lots of names flying around. Yeah.
Great. Angela touches Billy through Billy's clothes because Billy can feel Angela's touch, right? And that's what makes it a case of touching through.
So again, part of what motivated this, and I should say, because as far as we're aware, this isn't a puzzle that people have written about before. A lot of these kind of cases have come from like conversations we've had with friends, kind of often in the pub. It's a bit, we've got this puzzle, kind of what do you think? And a lot of these cases that's where these accounts have come from. But we think in each case, there's something intuitively plausible about them. So the idea here is, how do we work out whether someone has touched someone through something? Well, they touch something that's in contact with that person, and either the person being touched feels something, or a different version of the account, the person doing the touching kind of gets something, whether that's knowledge about what the person's kind of body is like, or the experience of feeling them, but you get some kind of experience from it. And the reason I guess we think this is kind of intuitive is going back to one of the reasons we think this is important around like the role that touch can play in our social lives. Kind of why can touch kind of sometimes suggest a certain kind of closeness or a certain kind of relationship? Well, it's kind of about experiencing each other in a certain way. Why do we care about other people touching us? Well, one reason is it feels a certain way to us. It gives us a certain experience. And that's kind of an important aspect of what touch involves. So one way to make sense of, well, what does it mean to touch someone through something is, well, either the person doing the touching has an experience of the person being touched, or the person being touched has an experience of what that's like. And it's kind of more of this, what we have here is a move towards thinking in terms of like mental states. So like it's people involved here. And kind of why might people care that they're being touched? And one is going to be that kind of feeling issue.
Okay, so why is that wrong?
Yeah, I feel like Robbie and I are playing good cop, bad cop here. Robbie sort of sets them up, smack them down. Yeah, I mean, there's just, again, quite simple worrying counterexamples to this. So firstly, take the view that what matters is that the toucher feels the touchy, has some experience of the person they're touching. Well, I mean, you can just imagine cases where sort of girlfriend or boyfriend, sort of they're sitting around there and they've been lying there for quite a long time, and someone's got a dead arm. She's got a dead arm, and she goes over and strokes her boyfriend through the back of his jumper or something, but can't feel anything because she's got a dead arm. Well, then she hasn't had the experience, and yet he's been touched. And one way of bringing out what's you might think not feel very moved by that, but one way of bringing out what would be so wrong about this is imagine a worse case of assault where in fact the assailant also had a dead arm when they groped someone. It would be a really, really weird and quite unpleasant defense for them to say, oh yeah, but I didn't even feel her. Like that's just like, yes, that's not the kind of thing which would excuse it and make it not assault anymore. That's not the relevant kind of factor.
And I guess also equally, if the touchy, i.e. the person being touched, didn't feel it, that also doesn't look like a very good defense, right?
Yeah.
Well, she didn't feel it, therefore I didn't touch it.
Yeah, exactly. So if you switch over to thinking, well, maybe what matters is whether the person being touched felt it, well, then the really big problems are going to be cases of people either asleep or under anesthetic or in comas, who are often actually very vulnerable, and so but yet won't feel the touch. And this kind of view would just make a mockery of the idea that they can be victims of assault. So there's definitely something attractive about thinking about it in terms of either party having some experience or getting some knowledge, but it's not going to deal with cases at all where somebody doesn't get the knowledge.
Good. Okay. Great. All right. So we are going to get to what you do think touching through it shortly, but we've got one more possibility to deal with first of all. If you guys want to switch round, by the way.
Yeah, I was going to say we can
switch good cop and bad cop roles. That's fine. So the final possibility is intention. So the idea here is Angela touches Billy through his clothes because Angela intends to touch Billy. That's what she's trying to do, right? Therefore, even though the clothes are in the way, it still counts as an instance of touching.
Yeah. So one of the things that kind of motivates this idea is that it's partly the moral background to it. So often what matters in assessing morality is like, did you mean to do it? So one difference between murder and manslaughter is the difference in intention. To murder someone, you need to kill them with the intention to kill them. And so that makes a big moral difference. And also, again, captures this thought that, the problem about touching through is something that only really arises when we're thinking about people interacting with each other. And most of what we do to each other is intentional. And so it seems kind of plausible to invoke intention, partly because it might bring it into line with other kinds of, it might bring touching through into line with other kinds of morally and legally relevant phenomena. And so just as with murder, you need the thing you do and the intention to do it, maybe with touching through, you need like putting yourself in a chain of contact and intending to put yourself in a chain of contact. So there's the thing you did, which is just like touch something that you're both touching, and then intend to do that. And if you've got those two factors, the kind of objective external factor and then the internal mental factor, that kind of comes together to make an act of touching through. And then that would also make sense of perhaps why we prosecute in terms of assault and so on, because there's a kind of parallel between assault and murder. Murder perhaps being a very, very aggravated form of assault.
Good. Yeah, that makes sense, because you presumably wouldn't want to call it assault if it had been unintentional, I take it. Yeah, or pass some kind of test for intention, right?
Yeah, and I thought it might be like, so maybe touch is similar. Maybe we don't want to say you've touched someone or touched someone through something if the intention isn't there. And our concerns about this are kind of, it will depend on what the relevant intention has to be. So there's some cases where we think, again, it's just going to come out false. It's just going to get the cases wrong. And there's perhaps an even more worrying problem where sometimes we think it's just going to be like circular or basically meaningless. So to take the kind of worries about falsity first, so kind of Will suggested one version of the intention, which might be someone touches someone through something if they intend to put themselves in a chain of contact whereby they're touching something which is touching something else, which is touching something else, which is touching the person. And if they intend to do that and they are in fact in that chain of contact, then they have touched that other person. The problem is if someone just has kind of really weird intentions or really weird views on how touching works, the kind of case we spoke about towards the beginning comes back again. So, we can imagine a kind of nice case where you've got like two children and one lives in England and one lives in Australia, and they kind of intend to like touch each other or like give each other a hug or something. And the way they do that is they both kind of lie down on the ground. And what they're intending to do is to create a chain of contact through like the Earth's surface. Yeah. And then we can imagine in a really wholesome way, they said, oh yeah, I hugged my friend today. I miss him and he's all that way away, but I gave him a hug. And on a version of the intention view, like that's literally true. Like they're correct in saying that they did touch each other through the Earth. Yeah. Why? Well, because they are in fact in a very long chain of contact, or at least a very big chain of contact through the Earth's surface, and their intention was to do that. And of course, it's kind of very sweet, but we want to say, but they, in a literal sense, we wouldn't say this to them, but in a literal sense, they haven't actually touched each other through the Earth. So one is that depending on how you plug in the intention, it's false. There's a more kind of complex worry, which, so I hope this cultural reference isn't too dated, but when I teach a similar problem in some teaching I do in the philosophy of sex, so in the TV show Friends, Phoebe talks a lot about a phalange, and we can imagine kind of someone saying to Phoebe, "Okay, but what is a phalange?" And Phoebe saying something like, "Well, look, it's a phalange. Anything's a phalange if you want it to be a phalange. It's the phalange is in your mind. That's what makes it a phalange." And her interlocutor would reasonably say, "Okay, but I don't know whether to think of something as a phalange unless you tell me what a phalange is. There's this kind of circularity. I can't tell whether it feels appropriate to call this thing a phalange yet because you've not told me what that means." So Phoebe's response is kind of circular. And we think we might see something similar with the intention view. So someone might say, well, look, something counts as touching through if you have that chain of contact and you intend to touch someone through something. But we can imagine someone sort of reasonably saying, well, hang on, what you were promising was to give us an account of whether I've touched someone through something. I don't know if what I'm intending to do is touching someone through something yet because you've not told me what that means. Yes. Do I intend to touch someone through something? You'd need to tell me what touching through is first before I can kind of meaningfully communicate whether I've done that. So in a lot of cases, it's kind of circular or meaningless. It's not really answered the question. It's just pushed it back a step.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. It's definitely not too dated for me, Robbie, but I'm told that the kids are all into Friends these days anyway, so maybe we're...
That's reassuring. That's very reassuring for my teaching as well, because, yeah.
So it's not intention. So it's not feeling, it's not intention, it's not counterfactual, it's not causation, it's not contact, or at least it's not just contact. So what is it then? What is it when we touch somebody through something? What does that actually mean?
So we've been thinking a lot about what it means to touch someone in general and what that might tell us about what it means to touch someone through something. And one way that we might make sense of what it is to touch someone just kind of directly, so I'm thinking of skin-to-skin contact, is we might find it helpful to make use of the idea of boundaries. So when you touch someone directly, you come directly into contact with their boundaries, or the boundaries of one person's body come into contact with the boundaries of another person's body. And there's elements of this in kind of liberal political theory, where they talk about kind of self-ownership and they talk about kind of assault and trespass in terms of coming up to the boundaries of a person's body. Some of them talk about it in terms of like personal territory. So just like invading a country might involve moving over their borders, we might also think of like a person's body having borders. Kind of at their skin. So what is direct contact? Well, it's when two kind of boundaries meet. And so what we want to do in our proposed solution is to kind of try and take that and say touching in general is when two kind of boundaries come into contact. But what we need to do is make sense of the idea that a person's boundaries or personal boundaries can move beyond the surface of the skin. So say my boundaries now, the boundaries of myself or the boundaries of my body don't end at my skin. They end at the very least kind of at the edge of my clothing. So if someone was to come and kind of pat me on the back over my shirt, we want to say something like, well, they're touching me through my shirt and my t-shirt because the kind of boundaries of my body in some way extend beyond my skin to the boundaries of my clothing. And then a lot of us trying to kind of work out that solution is looking into those kind of questions around, well, how do those boundaries work and how can we tell when they've been extended in that way?
Yes, okay. So what kind of boundaries do you have in mind? Like, how do you understand this idea of boundaries?
Yeah, so we've been really influenced by some lovely work by Talia May Betcher on where she's been interested in some very different questions, but has a really lovely framework for thinking about this. And she introduces a nice distinction between two types of boundaries. One is quite a simple thing. It's a material boundary. And so think of a material boundary as just any physical thing that can kind of get in the way of someone. And so like my clothing is a material boundary to me because it kind of occludes a part of my body from all of you guys, but also the walls are going to be material boundaries. They're just going to be the things that get in the way of viewing or touching people. Yeah. Fine. But there's a kind of richer sense of boundary in which we have like what she calls moral boundaries, which are the sort of, you think of it as our personal space in a way, the kind of boundaries which you have a kind of right over. And so one nice way of getting a grip on the relation between material and moral boundaries is by thinking about two kinds of violations which you get in legal and moral contexts. So on the one hand, there's privacy violations where if someone were to sort of lift up my shirt and snoop underneath, I would have had my privacy violated because I'm using my clothing to kind of protect myself. I'm protecting my privacy in a certain kind of way. And so that's a nice way of seeing that I'm using some material boundaries as to kind of embody my moral boundaries. I'm saying, look, you can't snoop under there. But also there's another kind of violation, which is a decency violation. And so if I were to, I'm not going to, but if I were to drop my trousers and then and strip, like that's a decency violation. And it violates you guys' right to not just be shown private parts of my body. And that's obviously what's going on with that. That's the moral wrong involved in streaking and flashing. Yeah. And so what's interesting about that is that my material boundaries that I'm using to protect my privacy are also, interestingly, your material and moral boundaries because they're protecting your decency. Yes. And so it's kind of one of the things that we think is really nice about this framework is that whilst the liberal theorists are sort of correct in saying, look, there's something special about the body and our right to bodily integrity and not to have our body messed with, what Talia May Betcher does by giving us this nice distinction is show us that actually like the body is the center of our kind of rights claims, but it emanates out this kind of moral sphere, if you like, which actually reaches all the way to not only to what we're wearing, but to what other people are wearing too. And so there's a kind of nice kind of relationship between these two types of boundaries.
Great. That's really interesting. So I can kind of see how that kind of account is going to rule out some of the wacky examples that you said the other accounts kind of fall foul of, right? So the bouncy castle account, right? The bouncy castle isn't really a moral boundary of either of those people in that case, and the same with the planet. When you've got the two people on the other side of the planet, there's no sense in which the planet is kind of part of my moral boundaries in the same way that my clothes are. But is it going to rule in the kinds of cases that you want to rule in? So like the kind of cases where we commonly think somebody is touching somebody through something, is that going to make sense of those cases, your account?
Yeah, so I think what this comes down to is there's going to be questions about like precisely how we specify when something has become a person's moral boundary. So what I guess Betcher gives us is this idea that there is a kind of boundary that can extend beyond the body, and that both our kind of material and moral boundaries can become kind of realized or instantiated in things that are not identical to the surface of our skin, clothing being the most obvious example. But you're right. So then there's the question of, okay, so does this accommodate kind of everything we want to? Precisely what is included in that? So we kind of, there's kind of some more resources that we take from Betcher that we think are really helpful. So Betcher has her own account of how she kind of how she identifies whether something counts as a moral and material boundary. And she does so in relation to the concept of intimacy, which she takes to be a kind of closeness that we have with someone, but it's a bit more than that. So she thinks you can become closer and closer to someone, you can know someone better and better, but intimacy is a kind of difference in kind. And she thinks what intimacy involves is kind of traversing or moving past a person's boundaries. So for Betcher, the way that she, I believe, identifies whether something counts as a person's moral boundary is, does crossing that boundary involve the kind of thing that usually signals intimacy between people? So, for example, we might think that there's a moral boundary around certain parts of our body, but not others. So Will had kind of examples earlier about certain kind of parts of the body that are more private. At the same time, there's no moral boundary around my hands. Right. There's no kind of worry about people viewing my hands particularly.
Right.
It's just that even if I'm wearing gloves.
Sorry to interrupt. I guess there's no moral boundary in terms of viewing, right? In terms of sight. Yes. So there might be a moral boundary in terms of actual touching with your hands.
Precisely. Yeah. So then there's this kind of interesting question about, well, there seems to be a kind of moral boundary around my hands in one sense, but not in another. Yeah. And I think Betcher has a really nice way of making sense of this, because she says, well, something counts as a moral boundary if crossing that boundary is the kind of thing that would usually signal that people are intimate. Right. So whereas kind of holding someone's hand and touching someone's hand usually signifies that kind of intimacy or a kind of closeness that those people have. It might not mean that they are in fact close, but we'll kind of come a bit later to kind of how we make sense of that, but it at least suggests that there's a kind of closeness between them. Whereas simply looking at someone's hand doesn't suggest that. Yeah. So in a sense, there is a moral boundary around my hands in that if someone came up and touched my hand, that signals a kind of intimacy between us. But in another sense, there isn't a moral boundary because in the sense of viewing my hand, there's no moral boundary around my hand being perceived, being viewed. And so Betcher kind of gives us this account that we basically want to take on, where she identifies whether something counts as a moral boundary by looking at, well, is it the kind of thing that usually signals whether kind of people are intimate? It might be worth us saying something about what that means in terms of kind of social meaning and so on. Yeah.
I mean, there's quite a lot of things that you could say at this point. Just to say something about the social meaning is that obviously, if you see two people who are very close, like spatially close, they're kind of like one's lying in the other's lap or something. There's a kind of social meaning to that. Like it allows an ordinary observer to kind of infer that they probably know each other. They're kind of intimate in some way that makes that appropriate. And so you might say like the social meaning of being spatially close to each other is that people are interpersonally close, that they kind of know each other, that maybe they like each other, these kinds of things.
Yeah.
And one way you can get at that is that it's a reasonable joke that people often make on the train when you're crammed into the underground somewhere around Piccadilly, and sort of everyone's crammed right up to each other, and sort of reasonable joke is like, you can at least buy me dinner first. Like, everybody knows that this is like, we describe these jokingly as like intimate relationships, because we know that like that's what the normal social meaning of being so close is. Yeah. And this is just like a case where it's thrust upon us in a kind of unfortunate, stinky situation. And so there's a kind of, as Robbie said, it's not like, it's what we often call in philosophy, like defeasible reason to believe that somebody's close. It's the kind of reason that can be undercut. It's not a final reason, but it gives you kind of a first glance kind of, okay, they're pretty close, probably absent some other sorts of factors. I can probably reasonably infer that they're close. And so there's a kind of social meaning to spatial closeness, but also getting spatially close to someone, like going and touching them, carries a presumption that that's an okay thing to do. And whether the presumption is right or wrong. So in the cases of assault, it's obviously wrong, but it does carry the presumption that it was right, but the presumption is just false. Yeah. But in the case where I hug my friend and we're just like happy to see each other, we're presuming that that's okay to do. And it is. There you go. That's great. So there's two kinds of presumption in play. There's the presumption that other people can make that people are close, when you've got spatial closeness. And then there's the kind of presumption that's involved in actually getting close to someone, presuming that it is okay. So that's, and perhaps at this point we can sort of like put all these bits together to tell you sort of what the actual account of touching through is, because up to now, so we kind of moved on from the accounts that we're rejecting, and we've been sort of developing some general tools to try and give an account. And so we've got these ideas of boundaries, we've got these ideas of the social meaning of getting spatially close, how that's connected with intimacy, how that's connected with presumption. And we can kind of put all these tools together to get a view of what it takes to touch someone through something. And our idea is basically that the idea we accepted at the beginning, there has to be some chain of contact. And the question was, what do we have to add to that to get our necessary and sufficient condition? What's enough to make it the case? We think that there has to be a chain of contact, and the thing that the parties are in contact with is the material and moral boundary of the parties. Right. So if Jerry reaches over and touches John on the shoulder through his jumper, why has he touched him through the jumper? It's because the jumper is a material boundary which is playing a role in securing the kind of moral boundaries of Jerry and John. And how do we know this? Well, because when Jerry touches John's jumper, that signals intimacy. It signals because it presumes that that's an appropriate thing to do. It presumes that Jerry is an intimate of John's, and that licenses observers to say, "Oh, Jerry knows John. They're kind of buddies." And so it licenses us to think, they has touched a material and moral boundary, and so he's touched him through the jumper. And contrast that with a case of where someone just touches a wall on one end and somebody else touches a wall on the other end, and we just think, well, gosh, no. But why? Because it's not a material and moral boundary of either party.
Great. Okay, so the account is that somebody touches somebody else through something if there is that chain of contact, and also the thing that they're putatively touching them through is a moral boundary. And you said for the parties, right? So one thing I was wondering is, firstly, does it have to be a moral boundary in some sense for both parties? Because I'm kind of thinking about cases where, one of the parties is an inanimate object, right? So, if I'm playing the piano with gloves on, there's a sense in which we might think, well, I'm touching the keys of the piano through my gloves, right? That just seems like an intuitive thing to say. And even though I can see why kind of morally that's less important than the cases you've got in mind, it might be just as puzzling, kind of in a philosophical sense, how we make sense of that, right? Because the kind of counterexamples to the other accounts that you presented seem to apply in that kind of case as well. So we're still going to need some kind of account of why I'm touching the piano keys through my gloves. But obviously the piano keys don't have moral boundaries. So like, can your account make sense of that kind of case as well?
Yeah, thank you. So we think so. So it's a really interesting case. And I think something this speaks to is one thing that we think is interesting and distinctive about our account is we take the interpersonal case to be central. So like the focus is on, can this work for the interpersonal case? And then, there's the question about, well, it seems like something similar is going on in cases where it's not two people. Like, can our account accommodate those cases? So we are optimistic that it can. So here's what I think we'd want to say in the case of the piano. So we have a person here who is wearing gloves. And we want to say that those gloves are a material and moral boundary of that person. How can we say that? Well, because ordinarily, if another person came and kind of touched their gloves, that would be indicative of a kind of low-level intimacy between those people. So we can say that that's how we know. The fact that that hypothetical comes out as true is enough for us to say that the gloves are a moral and material boundary of the piano player. So then what we can say is when they are playing the piano, they bring a material and moral boundary of themselves into contact with the piano. Right. And we think that's enough for it to meet our account. So we can say it's not a paradigm case, but our account would say, yes, the piano player can touch the piano through their gloves.
Okay. All right, well, what about a slightly different version of that case then? So what if for some reason, instead of wearing gloves, I've draped a sheet over the piano keys and I'm playing the piano through that sheet? Then it looks like the sheet isn't a moral boundary for me, or is it in some sense?
Yeah, great question. I think these are just tricky sorts of cases. Obviously, one thing we could say is that the sheet is a material moral boundary of me, because if someone were to come along and take that sheet and kind of put their hand beneath it, underneath my piano playing hands, and sort of fondle me, then clearly it's just as if I were wearing gloves. Yeah. And the fact that I didn't choose to put them on I didn't choose to put the sheet on in the morning, that's a bit by the by. If I get wrapped in cling film for some unfortunate art project and somebody comes along and touches me through the cling film, it doesn't matter if I decided to be wrapped in it or not. Right. I can still be I violated effectively if somebody were to come and do that. And so the kind of agency over these things is not quite to the point, even though in most of the normal cases it does look it. So one option for us is to kind of put our foot down and say, no, actually, it still is the right kind of boundary. Another option for us is to actually just kind of bite the bullet a bit and say, well, so what? You're not touching the piano through the sheet because it's not actually the right kind of boundary. And I think, it's a bit hard to choose between these two options. One reason is that it's not clear what's lost if we were to just say, actually, you don't touch the piano through the sheet. I mean, who cares? Yes. It's not an important case and it's not important because it's not a person on the other end of it. Yes. It doesn't matter whether you touch the piano. And so it's a bit hard to know what's actually lost in denying that.
I suppose the only thing that's lost is that it seems like a weird description of that case to say I'm not touching the keys through the sheet, right?
Yeah, but I think hopefully one of the things that we've been able to bring out is that this kind of very normal thing that we talk about all the time, touching people through things, is actually really weird.
Yes.
I think that's one of the things and that's one of the lovely things about philosophy, that like you go through your life and there's all this normal stuff and we are very, very competent judges of these things. Yeah. And yet, actually, it's all much weirder than you thought. Yeah. And so sometimes when you theorize about it, you end up saying things that are maybe a little bit strange, maybe a bit unintuitive, but ultimately, if it gets most of the stuff right, if it gets most of the cases right and answers our central important questions, a little bit of weirdness on the edges isn't too bad.
Yes, and I guess the other point to make is that I don't have a better account of why I'm touching the piano keys, right? So I completely accept all your all your counter examples to, the other accounts that seem to apply in that case as well. So
I mean, on that point, I guess we're kind of hoping that like this does lead other people to come up with, we're sure there's stuff that we're missing, and it would be kind of really great if people kind of do disagree with our account and say like, oh, but here's another account that might work. It's kind of part of what we want this kind of project to do is just kick off a bit of a discussion about, oh yeah, what does that mean? It's not actually so obvious.
Yeah, great. Well, maybe that's a good point to end it on then. And our listeners, if they have any other ideas about what touching through might be, then please do get in touch. So Robbie Morgan, Will Hornett, thank you very much for being on the podcast.
Thanks very much.
So much. Yeah, it's been great.
If you enjoyed this episode of Ethics Untangled, please like and subscribe and recommend us to your friends. The podcast is edited by Mark Smith at Leeds Media Services, and our music is by Kate Wood. Ethics Untangled is brought to you by the Idea Centre, a specialist unit for teaching, research, training and consultancy in applied ethics at the University of Leeds. We offer master's programmes in healthcare ethics and applied and professional ethics, and PhDs available full or part-time and face-to-face or by online learning. We also offer consultancy and training services for business and the professions, including help with the difficult ethical issues faced by your organisation, commissioned research projects, and online or face-to-face CPD. If you'd like to find out more about these or any of our other activities, please visit our website at ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics.